So our next presentation, we're delighted to have Cassandra Nguyen, and her co-author on this is Brian French.
Thank you so much for having us as part of this discussion today. It's really quite a delight to be able to participate in this grant program, as well as to share some of our early results with this venue of this conference. And the title of our work is Validity Evidence for the Use of the USDA Adult Food Security Survey Module with American Indian and Alaska Native Adults. And I'm pleased that I'm able to present this in collaboration with one of my co-authors, Dr. Brian French, and we are also supported by Dr. Kaimi Sinclair in our final paper. I'd like to start by simply stating that none of the authors on this piece have any conflicts to disclose. And then I will briefly go through a background about a related background to this topic. So we have estimates of American Indian, Alaska Native households' food insecurity with a scoping review that estimated that 46% of sampled households experienced food insecurity. And this is a scoping review of 30 studies that myself and a collaborative group completed and was just published recently in Advances in Nutrition. And the range of food insecurity prevalence estimate was quite wide among these 30 studies. It was as low as 16% and as high as 80%. And this range can be a product of study design or eligibility criteria, but it also can speak to the fact that the term American Indian and Alaska Native is really an umbrella term. And this is trying to capture individuals from over 600 plus tribes or villages, which each have their own unique histories, cultural practices and norms, and modern experiences. However, even with that wide range of food insecurity prevalence, we do see that even the lowest estimate of 16% is much higher than the general prevalence of about 10.5% food insecurity nationally. And given this public health crisis among American Indian and Alaska Native households, there are food security or food insecurity alleviation programs and also Indigenous food sovereignty initiatives that exist that attempt to address this priority issue. However, evaluations of these programs have not been widely published. There are a few intervention studies that were included in the scoping review, including the Navajo FVRX program, which was a fresh fruit and vegetable program, a prescription program where households with children were provided vouchers for produce. And they did find that food insecurity improved with fewer households reporting food insecurity at the end of that intervention. However, in looking at the current literature, we don't find many studies have validity evidence for the food security questionnaires to be used with American Indian and Alaska Native respondents. And in looking at some of the seminal work, including this paper that's referenced by Dr. Ed Frangillo Jr., and there's his summary of some of the initial studies that really point towards strong validity among the food security survey modules. There was a note that in this work that independent validation is really warranted for those populations that weren't largely represented in those initial samples, of those being, or one of those groups being American Indian and Alaska Native households. And this is in contrast with the impetus for the Food Security Survey Modules development, which is the National Nutrition and Related Monitoring Research Act of 1990 that Irma referenced in her timeline, which explicitly states Native households as a priority population rationale for this work. And this is really important not only because of that, but also because American Indian and Alaska Native households have this unique historical, cultural, and socio-political influences on their food experience. Many groups were forcibly relocated away from traditional lands, forced to rely on highly processed food commodity programs, which have recently gone through improvements, but still have a ways to go. And many households have limited access to traditional foods, are more likely to live in households below the poverty line, and then receive care from the Indian health services system, which is chronically underfunded in comparison to other healthcare systems. And so with the presence of all this history and continued kind of modern oppression, American Indian Alaska Native people are still here, and they've survived these experiences with resilience and continue to survive. And that resilience may produce and experience may produce even unique aspects of food security experiences in these households. And we're not the first to point out this potential concern about the food security survey modules being able to capture these experiences. Indigenous scholars have already raised these concerns over the last several years with both First Nation scholars in Canada, as well as scholars in the United States, which have noted the lack of reference to traditional food sharing systems, and other kind of food acquisition practices. And that brings me to the objective of our work, which was to address the question, do the food security survey module scores provide an accurate assessment on the prevalence of food security when it's used with American Indian and Alaska Native adults? And furthermore, how does the validity evidence for American Indian and Alaska Native respondents compare with individuals from other racial and ethnic groups? As I made note of in the title slide, this was not something that I pursued on my own. I'm part of a larger team. I was able to be mentored by Dr. Kaimi Sinclair, who has great expertise in Indigenous health as well as health education. And also my collaborator, Dr. Brian French, with his expertise in measurement and research methods. And he will be supporting the interpretation of the results in the presentation today. Before getting into the results, I want to note the data set that we used, which was the 2019 National Health Interview Survey. Food security is assessed with the 10-item USDA Adult Food Security Survey module, which asks about experiences of food hardship among adults in the household or among the household if the household is only comprised of a single adult member. We also were able to capitalize on the NHIS assessment of nutrition assistance program participation, which they ask about participation in SNAP, for reduced price lunches in the National School Lunch Program, and participation in the Special Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program for Women, Infants, and Children, also known as WIC. In addition, NHIS has health characteristics. These are self-reported characteristics that are assessed. So individuals are asked to rate their overall physical health on a scale of 0 to 4, from excellent to poor. And then individuals are asked whether or not they've ever been told by a healthcare provider whether or not they had hypertension, high cholesterol, or diabetes, and they answer yes or no to each of these questions. And it's also worth noting that we use race and ethnicity demographic data for our analyses, and we have 5 categories or 5 groups that individuals are allotted to. So the first being American Indian or Alaska Native, whether alone or with any other racial or ethnic groups or identities, followed by Black, Asian, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic white. And then we do also use other demographics to describe our sample and to get a sense of the sample's generalizability. For our analyses, we conduct descriptive statistics of the sample, and then also assess the scale dimensionality using confirmatory factor analysis. The item response theory item analysis includes model fit, item difficulty, and item discrimination. And this is followed by differential item functioning. And then finally finished up with some chi-squared tests looking at how food insecurity categorization compares with expected variables such as nutrition assistance program participation, household characteristics, and the self-reported health variables that I indicated in the last slide as a assessment of evidence for external validity in each of the racial and ethnic groups. To provide some insight into the sample that we're looking at, the entire sample is comprised of 30,052 adults. And then you can see here in each of the columns in this table, we show characteristics for our 5 racial or ethnic groups. In each group, we have over 500 respondents in the sample, and then some characteristics vary. So for example, among our non-Hispanic white adults, there are more older adults than in any other racial or ethnic group. And then in our Asian sample, the majority have a bachelor's degree or more and are have the highest prevalence of employment in the prior week of the survey in comparison to other racial and ethnic groups. But really what is interesting and striking to lead into our next assessment is the food insecurity prevalence in comparing these different racial and ethnic groups. We have the highest prevalence of food insecurity estimated for American Indian and Alaska Native adults at 21%, in contrast with the lowest prevalence among Asian adults at 3.5%. So to start with, I wanted to show a descriptive assessment of food security response or food security survey module item response patterns for the sample overall and by race and ethnicity. To orient you to this graphic, on the y-axis, we're looking at proportion of affirmative responses. And on the x-axis, we're looking at each of the items on the adult 10-item food security survey module. And we start with household item number 2 and end with adult specific item 5A. And these items are meant to start with the least severe indicators of food insecurity and end with the most severe indicators of food insecurity, with a kind of stair-step pattern that from the first item to the last item. And you can see for the most part, this stair-step pattern is followed. If you look at the solid black line in about the middle of the graph, you can see that's for all participants. And we see a pretty sequential drop from item to item with a small increase in proportion of affirmative responses when going from AD1A to AD2. This is likely because AD1A is a question that asks about the number of days where meals, the size of meals was cut, and is only asked of those that respond affirmatively to AD1. And we see that when we look at specific racial or ethnic groups, the differences between items, whether the decrease and also the increase from AD1A to AD2 does vary. And this serves just as a simple descriptive illustration of how responses within the questionnaire vary by racial and ethnic groups. However, it also leads us into our more formal testing, which was conducted by my colleague, Dr. Brian French, who will be going over the inferential analyses that he performed.
Thank you, Cassandra. I appreciate that. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. On this slide, we first examined if we could justify creating a total score of the food security measure, assuming that it did measure a single dimension of food security. It's how the scale is used in practice. It makes that assumption, and it's an assumption that underlies some of the additional analyses we conducted. So we first fit a simple one-factor model across those 10 items to the entire sample that we had. And you'll see those results in the table in terms of the fit indices. After that, we then fit this to each self-identifying subgroups that Cassandra mentioned, from those called the rows you'll see for white are American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Black, and Hispanic groups. Judging by the fit indices, we did find support for this one-factor model based on those 10 items, indicating that it is a unidimensional trait. We also estimated internal consistency reliability for that score via omega, and we found those values to be quite high. In fact, they were above 0.95, indicating that we can support high internal consistency reliability going across all of the 5 groups we looked at, as well as just the total sample. Next slide. Thank you. Next, as was mentioned in the first presentation, we did look at and used item response theory to see how these items were performing And we did this both in the total sample as well as cross groups. We first examined two models. One was the one parameter or the Roche model, which constrains those A parameters in the column you see in the table to be equal and can be a kind of a stringent assumption. In the recommendations that were made in 2006, it was also suggested that other IRT models be considered as alternatives to the Roche model. So we fit a two-parameter model, which relaxes that assumption of those equal A parameters across models. You can think of the A parameter as the relationship between the item and our overall total score, or the steepness of the curves you see in these figures. The figures on the right of your screen are a figure for each of the items, and those represent the item characteristic curve that traces the probability of endorsing a positive response to those 10 items. What we saw in the results was that the two-parameter model that allows A and B to be estimated fit better than the one parameter or the Roche model. For instance, if you look at the A column, you'll see that there is variability in those A values. The highest A values occur where Cassandra was talking about those step points for the middle items. Let's see. We also saw in the B items, as you would expect, those values go up from item 1 to item 10, as we would expect, meaning it's more difficult, if you want to think as B as item difficulty, as you have to have a higher level of food insecurity to endorse those items. Okay, so next slide, please. After we looked at those items and how they were functioning overall, and as expected, we were interested to see how those A and B parameters and the items as a set were performing across our five subgroups to see if we could make conclusions about if the items worked similarly across them. So we began by estimating the two-parameter model that fit best across the IRT models for each group separately. And so here in this figure, you have the A parameters by group for all 10 items. You can see that from item 1 to item 10, with each of the bars representing our groups, starting on the left with the respondents who identified as white. And then for each item on the right, you would have the Hispanic bars. What we see here across the A parameters is a somewhat similar, but we do see that there's some exceptions here, where, for instance, the respondents who identified as Asian seem to have some of the highest A values in comparison to some of our other respondents. We also saw that respondents identifying as white, when you look across the items, tended to have some of the lowest A values. Next slide, please. On this slide, you have our B parameters, the item difficulty parameters. And again, we looked across all the items for each group to see how these were performing. In general, we did see a similar trend in how those values were functioning from item to item for each of those groups. We did see for the respondents identifying as white, on average, they tended to have higher values or more difficult items for them to endorse, meaning they had to have a higher level of food insecurity to endorse a positive response, especially at items 8, 9, and 10 as you look at those. To formally evaluate the differences between these groups on the A and B parameters, we conducted differential item functioning analysis. This is the first result that you see on this slide. And here what we did was we looked at those item characteristic curves, both the A and B parameters, to see if we saw differences in our groupings. How we did this was we used the respondents identifying as white as our main group or our comparison group and compared them to each of our subgroups. And then we looked at those differences between the B values and the A values on how the items are functioning. What you'll see in the graph are 3 different lines: the green line, the yellow or orange line, and the red line. Because we tested so many items with so many groups, we were concerned a little bit about inflation of type 1 error for these items. So instead, we focused on the effect sizes or the magnitude of differences. Here, what you see with those different lines is the magnitude of B differences we might be concerned about, where it touches both at the green or below line would be differences that probably aren't large enough to be concerned with how the items might be functioning across these groups. Where that orange line represents a moderate difference, where we might want to review these items and think carefully about how they're functioning and the content of the item to see if we can understand why they might be functioning differently. And the red line is a large difference, indicating we really want to take a close look at why that's happening, because it could be causing some issues in scoring when we're creating scores across groups and then making comparisons. What you'll see is none of those lines, our bars for each group of those comparisons, touch or pass the red line, meaning we saw no really large effect sizes. However, we did see some of those differences reached the moderate effect sizes. And that was specifically for our respondents who identified as white versus Asian. And that's specifically the case for the last 3 items on the scale. In this case, the items were more difficult for our respondents identifying as white compared to our respondents identifying as Asian. So in those cases, we'd want to take a close look at those items to try to understand what's happening there. Let me point out that these differences are different than what Cassandra showed you on this step function graphs in the very beginning, because here we're making these comparisons when we're controlling for overall food security or insecurity scores. In other words, we're matching respondents at each score level and then making the comparisons, so we're making more fair comparisons. So those are our differences on the B parameters. Next slide. Here are the differences in the A parameters. It's a bit easier to look at, even though we see some more spikes in the A parameters. You only observe a green line here that I've placed into the graph, because none of the differences we saw would raise to a level of concern in terms of major differences between how the A parameters were functioning. So from these analyses, what we conclude is that there's pretty good support for how the items work across our different groups. With a few exceptions, we have high internal consistency reliability, and we can assume a total score to use. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Cassandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So next, in our final results that I'm going to highlight are the results of the chi-squared analyses as evidence for external validity, comparing food security classification of adults as food insecure or not in comparison to other household or individual characteristics. And we compare these across the 5 racial and ethnic groups, similarly to our prior analyses. So looking at our top results here, which are education and family income to poverty ratio, we see in line with our expectations that we have higher food insecurity prevalence among those with high school or less than high school education, in contrast with those with the highest level of education. And the same is true for income to poverty ratio of the household, where the lowest or those below 1 have higher prevalence of food insecurity in comparison to those with ratios at 5 or greater. And these comparisons were significant, and these distributions were significant for all participants, as well as when we stratified analyses by racial and ethnic identity. In addition, we also compared nutrition assistance program participation, and we do again see that those who participate in these programs have a higher prevalence of food insecurity in comparison to those that do not. And this holds for all racial and ethnic categories, with the exception of the WIC program, where there was not a significant relationship between food insecurity prevalence and WIC participation. And this may be because this is a smaller sample of 267 individuals that are women less than 50 with children less than 5 years old. It looks like I'm running short on time, so I'm just going to quickly go through the next slides, where we have consistent results for overall self-rated health, and then we have consistent results for all of our diet-related chronic diseases, with the exception of diabetes for our American Indian and Alaska Native sample, which may be because of the elevated prevalence of diabetes in this sample at 16.5% versus 10% overall. And so overall, our results support use of the food security survey scores to classify American Indian and Alaska Native adults as food insecure. Items function similarly across groups with a few exceptions, with Brian highlighting the last 3 items on the questionnaire about losing weight and not eating for whole days as questions that may warrant further exploration. And for future directions, we suggest replication of this study with the current population survey, qualitative work with American Indian Alaska Native people, as well as considering Asian and Hispanic respondents, though that wasn't the focus of this work. And then looking at implication inference evidence, focusing on if food security survey module scores lead to actions that change food security status. And with that, that brings me to my final slide, and I'd like to thank everyone for this time and their attention.